They cut me off mid-sentence. "We're done here," Lance said, leaning back in his chair like this was just another Tuesday instead of the end of 18 years of my life. Termination effective immediately. My name is Andy Pearson. I'm 57 years old, and I was about to teach a Harvard MBA, the most expensive lesson of his career. We were sitting in what used to be my conference room, now decorated in his style. Too much glass, too much chrome, too many expensive things meant to remind you who had the money. Lance Whitfield had one ankle resting on his knee, glossy Italian loafer showing just enough sock to flash a designer logo. On the table in front of him lay a tablet, screen still on something I recognized instantly, a Rolex configurator. He lazily flicked through watch faces and bands with one hand while he finished dismantling my career with the other. "Before you go," he added, not looking up, "you'll initiate transfer of all client contracts to corporate today. No delays, no excuses. Legal needs everything centralized under Whitfield Acquisition Group by close of business." I sat across from him, hands folded, expression neutral, listening like this was any other operational meeting. The HR director, Michelle Rodriguez, sat 2 chairs to my left, back straight, fingers laced tightly on the table, printed separation packet in front of her like a shield. She wouldn't meet my eyes. On the other side of the table, Christopher Walsh, a junior corporate attorney, hovered over a laptop. The cursor blinked in a draft email titled "Andy, Contract Portfolio Migration Confirmed." Lance still hadn't looked at me properly. He was mid-40s, immaculate haircut, custom suit, the kind of tan that didn't come from honest work. He'd acquired Pinnacle Advisory Solutions, the firm I'd built from a 2-person shop into a 40-client operation, like someone picking up a distressed asset at a weekend auction. "Did you hear me, Andy?" he asked finally, eyes still on the tablet. "Everything moves under Whitfield Acquisition Group. Client contracts, recurring revenue. That's what we bought. That's what we're consolidating." I watched him scroll past a Platinum Day date, then I smiled. "Yes," I said calmly. "I heard you." He clicked to a different bezel. "Good. Then we're aligned. You'll send legal whatever they need today. Our corporate team will take it from there." "I'm afraid I'm unable to do that," I replied. Same calm tone. His finger froze above the screen. Slowly, he looked up. "Excuse me." I held his gaze. "The contracts," I said. "The client agreements you're referring to, they're with me personally. Not with Pinnacle Advisory Solutions, not with Whitfield Acquisition Group, with Andy Pearson as an individual." The HR director's head snapped up. The lawyer stopped typing. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of air conditioning and distant keyboard clatter from the bullpen outside. Lance's expression shifted from bored superiority to something sharper. "Don't waste my time," he said. "We acquired your firm. That includes your book of business, all contracts, all revenue streams. That's what the purchase price was for." "You acquired the entity," I said, still polite. "You did not acquire my personal service agreements. The distinction is very clear in every contract your team apparently didn't bother reading." Walsh started frantically flipping through a folder. Lance ignored him. "This is absurd," he said. "You can't just decide your clients belong to you after we've bought the company." "That's not how this works. I didn't decide it today," I replied. "I structured it that way 18 years ago. Every client engagement is with me as a named individual advisor. Pinnacle is an administrative platform in those documents, not the counterparty. When you bought Pinnacle, you purchased office furniture, brand usage, some junior staff, and a lease. You did not purchase the relationships that generate the revenue you think you own." "You're playing games here," Lance snapped. "We'll litigate this right now. You're going to log into the system and initiate transfer, or we'll consider this willful interference with a transaction." Walsh cleared his throat carefully. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, voice tentative, "I'm looking at the standard agreement template now. Section 2.1 states Principal Advisor Andy Pearson, hereafter advisor, engaged in his personal professional capacity. The signature block shows Pinnacle only as an administrative service provider, not as the contracting party." Lance's eyes flicked toward him. "Meaning?" Walsh swallowed. "Meaning the contracts might technically be between Mr. Pearson and the clients, sir. Not between the clients and Pinnacle Advisory Solutions." The room tightened. "Is that true?" Lance asked me. "It is," I said. "Intentionally. Clients hire me personally. Pinnacle has always been the scaffolding I built around my work so we could scale operations without diluting responsibility. You realize what you're implying?" Lance said slowly. You're implying that we paid 7 figures for an entity whose main revenue engine walks out the door the moment you do. I'm not implying anything, I said. I'm clarifying the reality your due diligence team ignored. Michelle shifted uncomfortably. Andy, she said softly, surely we can find a cooperative way to handle this. Everyone expected a transition period. We just need you to honor the intent of the acquisition. The intent, I said, was for Whitfield Acquisition to acquire a perpetual stream of consulting revenue without understanding how that revenue was structured or who actually owned it. That's not my oversight. Lance's fingers flexed on the armrest. You really think you can hold 40 corporate contracts hostage? Do you have any idea how many lawyers we have? I'm not holding anything hostage, I replied. You terminated me 30 minutes ago. Our relationship is over. The client relationships you assumed were part of your deal were never yours to begin with. They're mine until I decide otherwise. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about who really owned what all along. Walsh murmured something under his breath. Michelle looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Lance stared at me across the table, that Rolex configurator still glowing faintly beside his elbow. He had no idea that the revenue stream keeping this building open wasn't tied to the company he just purchased. It was tied to a person he just fired on the spot. In 90 days, when client renewal season hit, and they realized their contracts didn't roll over to corporate by default, that oversight would cost him more than any watch on that screen. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and show you how a quiet, contract-obsessed consultant spent 18 years turning his name into the actual asset, and how one arrogant owner who thought he'd bought a business discovered he'd really just bought the furniture. Before Pinnacle Advisory Solutions existed, I spent 17 years inside other people's firms watching the same pattern repeat. The rainmakers, the ones whose names clients circled when they signed, didn't own their own work. They generated trust. The firm captured it. When those people left, the firm sent out transition notices like nothing had changed, as if the client had hired a logo instead of a human being. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. What stuck with me wasn't the departures. It was the conversations nobody outside saw. The clients who said we're staying, but only because Carol promised she'd be involved, then discovered she'd been quietly moved off their account. The senior partner who told a top performer, "You're valuable, but don't forget whose name is on the building." The performance reviews that said your clients love you, followed by compensation decisions that said, but the firm comes first. I learned 2 lessons there. Clients attach to people, not entities. Whoever owns the contract owns the relationship. My background shaped this thinking more than most people realize. I spent 4 years in the Marines after high school, 1985 to 1989. Not because I was particularly patriotic or looking for adventure, but because I needed structure and my family couldn't afford college. The Corps taught me something that served me well in business. Preparation beats improvisation every time. You don't win fights by being tougher or smarter in the moment. You win by thinking through scenarios before they happen and positioning yourself accordingly. A Minor Heart episode 8 months ago reminded me that time isn't unlimited. When your cardiologist tells you to reduce stress at 57, you start thinking differently about what matters. Building something that could survive without destroying me in the process became more important than building something impressive. My kids are grown, but I've got grandchildren now. They need their grandfather around, not stressed into an early grave over corporate politics. So when I left to start Pinnacle Advisory at 39, I built the entire business around one principle. My name would be on anything that mattered. Not because I needed my ego stroked, but because I needed clarity for everyone involved. Pinnacle started in a second-hand office between a dentist and a tax prep shop in a strip mall on the edge of Houston. 2 desks, 1 shared printer, no receptionist. My first 3 clients came with me when I left my previous firm. Not because I asked them to, but because they called my personal number the day after my resignation and said, "Wherever you go, we're following." When I drafted my first engagement letter from that strip mall office, I did something that would define the rest of my career. I put my own name in the parties section, not Pinnacle Advisory Solutions represented by Andy Pearson. Just this agreement is between client X, hereafter client, and Andy Pearson, hereafter advisor. Pinnacle Advisory Solutions serves as administrative and billing support to advisor. It felt almost too simple when I typed it, but I knew exactly what it meant. If a client stayed happy, the firm benefited. If a client left, the firm couldn't pretend the relationship existed independent of me. And if anyone ever tried to buy the firm without understanding that distinction, the contracts would tell the truth they didn't want to see. People told me I was being paranoid. Just put it under the company, a friend said. Makes it easier to sell later. Exactly, I said. I don't want it to be easy to sell without me. For 18 years, Pinnacle grew, not explosively but steadily, intentionally. We focused on one thing: complex revenue restructuring for mid-market businesses that had outgrown their first financial systems but weren't big enough to attract the top-tier consulting firms. On paper, we were strategic financial advisors. In reality, my days were spent deep in the guts of clients' operations, untangling pricing matrices that had been built one exception at a time, rebuilding forecasting models that assumed every year would look like the one before, designing incentive plans that stopped rewarding behaviors that were slowly killing margins. Most importantly, I became the person they called when their quarterly numbers didn't make sense and their CFO couldn't explain why. We never advertised. Our website was a single page with a logo, a phone number, and an email address. All of our growth came from one source: someone sitting across a desk from a CEO saying, "You should talk to Andy." Here's the thing nobody in corporate ever quite understands. When a client writes a check for 6 figures to fix something existential, they're not buying a process. They're buying a person they trust not to break what's left. When their revenue model is hemorrhaging cash and their board is asking uncomfortable questions, they don't want a consulting team. They want Andy Pearson, the guy who fixed similar problems for 3 other companies they know personally. So when I wrote those contracts with my name on them, clients didn't blink. If anything, it reassured them. They weren't agreeing to be passed around a team of junior consultants. They were hiring me with a support structure behind me. Every engagement letter followed the same pattern. Client engages advisor Andy Pearson to perform specified services. Advisor may utilize staff and third-party contractors as necessary. Pinnacle Advisory Solutions provides administrative, billing, and logistical support. Termination, renewals, and scope changes are negotiated directly with advisor. Legal teams from the client side flagged it the first few times. Why is this with you personally? Because that's who you're hiring. I would say, if I leave, you should have a choice. More often than not, that answer made them like me more. I'd learned another lesson early. Transparency is its own kind of leverage. When you're clear about what you're offering and what you're not, people trust you more, not less. By year 15, we had 40 active clients, a small team of analysts and operations people to handle the work I didn't need to personally touch, and a reputation in our niche as the people you called when you'd already tried everything else and nothing had worked. The contracts still all had my name on them, every single one. The contracts renewed annually or biennially. Sometimes clients downgraded scope. Sometimes they expanded, but the pattern was the same. When renewal time came, they didn't ask, "Is Pinnacle still available?" They asked, "Is Andy still going to be personally involved?" If the answer was yes, they signed. If the answer was no, they took a beat and thought hard. That's what Lance's acquisition team never truly internalized. They saw a firm with stable revenue, long-term client relationships, strong margins, a founder approaching 60. On a spreadsheet, it looked perfect. Succession-ready consulting platform with loyal client base. The banker's brochure probably said the numbers convinced them. The contracts would have warned them if they'd read them properly. The first hint that Pinnacle was about to be sold didn't come from me. It came from a client. Got a call from someone over at Whitfield Acquisition. My contact at a manufacturing client said one afternoon, "They asked what we thought about your firm-level capabilities." Sounded like acquisition sniffing. I hadn't talked to any bankers, but my minority partner, Pete Anderson, had been increasingly restless. He liked the idea of a payday more than the work itself. Pete was 10 years younger than me, had joined the firm 5 years in when we needed capital to expand. Good analyst, solid client relationships, but he'd started talking about exit strategies more than growth strategies. That night before I confronted him, I did something that made people around me roll their eyes. I reread every active contract, all 40 minus cover to cover, looking for any clause that could be interpreted as assignable to a successor firm without advisor consent. There were none because I'd written them that way on purpose. The next day, I asked Pete directly. He admitted it immediately. "I've been having exploratory conversations," he said. "Nothing concrete, but we're at a point where an exit could make sense. You've built something valuable, Andy. We should realize that value." "We?" I asked. "Pinnacle," he said quickly. "You, me, the team. Look, Whitfield Acquisition has infrastructure. They can plug us into bigger clients. This is how firms grow up. I told him the same thing I'd told clients for 18 years. Clients hire me. The contracts reflect that. If someone wants to acquire Pinnacle, they need to understand they're not just buying a logo and a lease. They're partnering with a person, or they're buying something hollow. He waved it off. Lawyers will sort it out. That's what they're paid for. They did sort it out. Just not in the way Lance thought. The deal moved fast. Too fast. I let it, not because I was eager, but because I was curious. The acquisition docs were dense. Dozens of pages of representations and warranties, indemnification provisions, earn-out structures. I read every line that mentioned clients' contracts or assignability. Every time, the language said some version of Pinnacle represents that it has the right to perform administrative services under existing client agreements. Not owns, not controls, not may assign at will, just performs. Their legal team tried at one point to slip in a schedule listing assigned contracts. I struck through it, wrote in the margin, "Client agreements are personal service contracts with advisor. Not assignable without client and advisor consent." My attorney backed me. "They can't force you to assign what you don't own," she said. Pete complained, "You're going to tank the deal." "If the deal depends on pretending we own what we don't," I replied, "it should be tanked." Lance's team pushed back weakly, then, to my mild surprise, conceded. They wanted the platform, the brand, the optics. They convinced themselves the clients would come along naturally. After all, they reasoned, nobody builds a 40-client consulting practice and then walks away from it at 57. The founder would want to transition smoothly, maintain relationships, preserve his legacy. They weren't entirely wrong about my motivations, but they completely misunderstood who had the power to determine how that transition would work. For the first 3 months after the acquisition, not much changed on the surface. We kept the same office, same email addresses, same analyst team. Whitfield Acquisition sent in their integration people to talk about synergies and shared service efficiencies. I sat through those meetings like a ghost. I answered questions when asked. I watched carefully when they pulled up revenue breakdowns on the projector. Lance visited twice. First time, he did the friendly new owner routine. Shook hands, smiled, talked about honoring the legacy I'd built. He called me a cornerstone of the organization and promised that nothing fundamental would change. He even brought coffee from some expensive roaster downtown, like we were all going to be best friends now. Second time, he arrived with a finance director. Less friendly, more focused. They walked through the P&L line by line, asking pointed questions about cost centers and efficiency metrics. When they got to my compensation, the finance director winced visibly. "We're essentially overpaying for a single producer," he said to Lance, not quietly enough. "Once we transition these relationships to the corporate brand, we can normalize this line item. Clients aren't attached to a logo. They're attached to trust," I said from across the table. "That trust has my name on it." Lance smiled thinly. "Clients adapt, Andy. If we handle the transition professionally, they won't mind who signs the email. We've done this before. People are more flexible than they think when they're getting the same quality of service." He believed that because in his world, brands were everything. Names were disposable. Consultants were interchangeable resources. He'd probably bought and sold a dozen service companies where the founders smiled, took their checks, and disappeared into retirement without a ripple. He genuinely thought I'd be grateful for the opportunity to step back and let his team handle the heavy lifting. At 57, wouldn't I want to ease into a more advisory role? Maybe work part-time, focus on the biggest clients. Let the corporate infrastructure handle the day-to-day grind. What he didn't understand was that the day-to-day grind was the relationship. When a client's quarterly numbers went sideways at 11 p.m. on a Friday, they didn't want to call a customer service line. They wanted to call Andy Pearson's cell phone. When their CFO quit unexpectedly and they needed someone to walk their board through the financials, the next morning, they didn't want a corporate consulting team. They wanted the guy who'd been in their conference room 6 months earlier, who understood their business model and could explain their numbers without a PowerPoint deck. Lance saw inefficiency where clients saw reliability. He saw cost where they saw value. He saw a founder who needed to be transitioned out where they saw the reason they'd signed in the first place. 3 weeks after his second visit, the termination meeting appeared on my calendar. Back in that glass and chrome conference room, Lance's irritation finally cracked through his polished demeanor. "You think these clients are going to walk away from a full-service advisory platform because we change one name on a contract?" he asked. No, I said. I think they're going to walk away because you fired the one person they actually hired. Michelle flinched. Walsh stared at his keyboard. Let me be clear, Lance said. You are no longer an employee or representative of any Whitfield entity. If you interfere with these relationships, we will consider it solicitation in violation of your separation agreement. I haven't signed any separation agreement, I said. And even if I had, nothing in it could retroactively convert my personal service contracts into corporate property. You don't get to declare ownership after the fact. We'll see what the courts say, he snapped. We both knew he hated that idea. Courts are slow, clients are not. Before you take this any further, I added, you might want to ask your team one question. On how many of those contracts does the client's legal department have my personal cell number listed as the primary contact? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The lawyer knew, the HR director knew, everyone who'd watched me work for the last decade and a half knew. When something broke, nobody called Pinnacle. They called me. I walked out of that meeting without a box. I didn't take anything from the office because nothing I cared about lived there. My client notes were already backed up on my own systems. My templates and models were mine. The only thing that stayed behind was the logo on the door. By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone had 3 new emails, not from Lance, from clients. Subject lines like, quick question, you have a minute, and got a weird email just now. The weird email was the same one sent to all 40 clients an hour after my termination. Dear valued partner, as part of our continued growth, Pinnacle Advisory is now fully integrated into Whitfield Acquisition Group. Your services will continue uninterrupted under our expanded platform. Going forward, your primary contact will be. They dropped my name in the 3rd paragraph. Past tense, Lance really did believe that a paragraph could replace a person. 10 minutes later, sitting in my car with my key in the ignition, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go. 30 seconds later, it rang again. This time, a name I recognized, CFO of a long-term client. I answered. Andy, he said, without preamble. Did you leave or did they push you out? They terminated me, I said, effective immediately. He swore quietly. They just sent some corporate email telling us we're in good hands with the new team. Do we still have a contract with you? You have a contract with me, I said. That hasn't changed. Then we're not going anywhere, he replied. Send us whatever we need to sign to make that clear. That call set the pattern for what came next. Here's what Lance expected. Clients would receive a glossy email. They'd shrug, file it away, keep paying the same invoices under a new letterhead. Revenue would continue -1 overpaid founder salary. Here's what actually happened. Within 48 hours, 17 clients had called or emailed me directly. 9 had explicitly said, we're staying with you, not the firm. 3 had already forwarded the corporate transition email with some variation of, this is unacceptable. Within 2 weeks, 24 clients had sent formal letters to Whitfield Acquisition stating that their agreements were with me, not the acquired entity. Several attached copies of their original contracts with my name circled in the parties section. 2 had their legal teams draft language making it unmistakable. Our engagement is with advisor Andy Pearson in his personal capacity. Whitfield Acquisition Group has no contractual relationship with this client. Within 60 days, Lance's legal team had stopped blustering and started negotiating. Lance's tone in the few messages he sent shifted from "we own this" to "how do we avoid public embarrassment?" The math was brutal. Pinnacle's value on paper had been based on those client relationships. Without me, those relationships were not transferable assets. Every time a client chose me over the company, the goodwill on Lance's balance sheet shrank. I didn't need to fight, I just needed to answer my phone. The disaster for Lance wasn't a single dramatic moment, it was renewal season. Our contracts were staggered, but there was always a cluster in Q2. That's when the real numbers hit. Lance sent out renewal packages under their banner. Clients forwarded them to me. Is this what we're supposed to sign now? Only if you want to be their client instead of mine, I said. Most didn't. They insisted on new agreements directly with me, not with any entity I didn't control. On a spreadsheet in Lance's finance department, the numbers told a story nobody wanted to present in a board meeting. Projected recurring revenue down 71%. Earn-out targets for the acquisition. Unreachable. Assumptions about firm-level stickiness. Wrong. Lance had bought a body without checking whether the heart was attached. By the time he realized it, the heart was beating just fine somewhere else. The fallout at Whitfield came to me in fragments. An email forwarded by a sympathetic former colleague. A LinkedIn status update from someone who used to share my office. A late-night phone call from Michelle, the HR director who'd sat in that termination meeting looking like she wished the table would swallow her. "I wanted to apologize," she said. "I knew something was off when you said the contracts were with you. I should have pushed harder." "You're not the one who signed the purchase agreement," I said. "Neither is he anymore," she replied. "Lance is moving on to pursue other opportunities." Of course he was. People at his level rarely get fired. They transition. Behind closed doors, though, the story was clear enough. The board was not happy. The bankers were embarrassed. Whitfield had to write down a significant portion of the acquisition value. All because the person they thought they could discard was the person the business was actually built around. On my side of the fence, things looked very different. I had a choice. I could rebuild Pinnacle under a new structure, or I could finally formalize what the contracts had always said implicitly. The asset was me. I chose the latter. I formed a new single-member LLC purely for liability and tax purposes. No brand name, no logo, just a clean, boring entity. Person advisory group with one advisor, me. I sent every client a letter, not written by legal, written by me. It said, in essence, you hired me. I'm still here. Our agreement is still valid. If you want to continue, sign this updated version that clarifies Whitfield has no involvement. If you'd rather explore other options, I understand, and I'll help make the transition clean. Every single one of my long-term clients signed. A few newer ones took longer, some renegotiated scope. One large client used the chaos as leverage to push for different terms. I accepted that because for the first time in 18 years, I was operating without the weight of a partner who wanted to scale faster than relationships could sustain. My effective income dipped for a quarter, then surpassed what it had been under Pinnacle because I wasn't splitting anything with anyone who thought a spreadsheet could replace trust. 8 months later, I ran into Lance at an industry event. He looked smaller minus, not physically, but energetically. The swagger was tamped down. We exchanged the kind of nod two people share when they've been in the same storm and know they're never going to talk about it in public. He came over anyway. "You really did it," he said, not angry, almost impressed. "You walked with most of the book." "I didn't walk with anything that wasn't mine," I said. "Clients chose," he sighed. "Legal says we should have insisted on assignment clauses. Bankers say we should have priced you staying on differently. Everyone has a theory now." "That's what they're paid for," I replied. He stared at his drink. "Would you do it the same way again?" "Structuring everything around yourself." "Absolutely," I said, with one change. "What's that?" I'd make the language even clearer so nobody could tell themselves a story later about what they thought they were buying. He nodded slowly. "You're going to make a lot of people in my position very nervous when they hear this story." "They should be less nervous about me," I replied, "and more nervous about how many other assets they think they own that are really just people they don't respect." He didn't have a comeback for that. We left it there. If you've built anything, people rely on code, systems, client relationships, institutional knowledge. Here's the part that matters for you. Leverage doesn't come from how important you feel. It comes from how things are written. You can be the backbone of a company and still have zero leverage if every contract, every title, every policy says you're just an employee. You can also look small on an org chart and hold enormous quiet power because your name is on the agreements. Your rights are spelled out in black and white. Your relationship to the work is defined on your terms. Most people only think about this when it's too late. When they're sitting across from someone like Lance being told they're done. When the new owner starts scrolling through his version of a Rolex catalog and issuing orders like transfer everything today. That's not the time to start caring about Section 2.1 of your contract. That's the time you find out whether you were careful or careless 7 years ago. If someone listening to this is only going to remember one sentence, let it be this. If the work is yours, the agreement needs to say so. Not verbally, not in an email, in the actual contract. And if you're ever in a room like that conference room, someone across from you giving orders, they believe you're obligated to follow. Assuming control they never actually earned, you don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to threaten. You don't need to bluster. You just need to know with absolute certainty what the paper says, so that when they say transfer all contracts to corporate today, you can smile and answer calmly, without anger. I'm unable to do that. Those contracts are with me personally, not the company. Lance learned the hard way that in business, like in combat, Preparation beats improvisation every time. And preparation, as any Marine will tell you, isn't paranoia. It's the difference between controlling your own destiny and becoming someone else's cautionary tale. At 57, I understood that the contracts you sign today determine not just the money you'll make tomorrow, but the choices you'll have when everything you've built is suddenly on the line. The real tragedy isn't that Lance lost 7 figures on a bad acquisition. It's that thousands of professionals will spend their entire careers building value for companies that can fire them in 30 minutes and keep everything they created, simply because they never learned to put their name on what matters. When you are 57 and looking back at decades of work, the question isn't whether you were successful, it's whether you were smart enough to own your success, because the difference between those two things is the difference between security and starting over.